Well, hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much for taking the time to hear some of the most updated news about cyber defense at NATO. I'm Sorin Dukaru, since December, senior fellow with the Hudson Institute, very much engaged with the Hudson Cyber Project, and former Assistant Secretary, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, and one of the key aspects that I've been engaged in was cyber defense. And I had the distinct pleasure to have a superb team, to be engaged with a superb cyber team, who is led currently by Christian Lifflander. Christian is, I think, one of those who has been part of NATO cyber section from its very creation around 2010, when also the Emerging Security Challenges Division was created. Not that NATO did not address cyber before, and I see here Peter Flory, who was Assistant Secretary General, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment, and at that time it was that division that was addressing the cyber issue. But since 2010, the cyber developments have been one of the key and most dynamic stories within NATO. And of course, this was also very much driven by the threat landscape. I think it's clear that watching the news, that cyber defense or cyber attacks have become the kind of weapon of choice for international confrontation these days. And they target and they affect domains like critical infrastructure, energy, transport, up to national elections or military operations. And I think it's not by chance that, especially in the recent period, national governments decided to go public, also in attributing such cyber attacks, and the most high-profile examples were recently in February this year, the public attribution to the Russian military of the devastating so-called NotPetya attacks of mid-July last year. And even more recently, last week, the US and UK, in the case of US, it was the Department of Homeland Security and CERT US that highlighted the danger of specific malware or Trojans that were installed by Russian actors into switches or routers that are reflect the backbone of our internet. So it's in this context that cyber defense has been a growing theme, area of focus within NATO. And less than 2 years ago at the Warsaw Summit, heads of state and government launched the so-called cyber defense pledge, aimed at strengthening the resilience of NATO and allied networks, but also recognized cyberspace as a new domain of military operations. And we are just a couple of months ago to the upcoming summit that will take place in mid-July in Brussels, where the cyber issue is one of the high-profile subject, especially when it comes to the key theme of strengthening NATO's deterrence and defense, and also when it comes to the issue of projecting stability vis-a-vis the allied partners, and strengthening their cyber resilience is also one key area. And last but not least, it's also a driving force of NATO modernization. So it's in this context that it's a distinct pleasure to greet Christian Lifflander. He is a continuously rising star within NATO. He, elevated his status just in a couple of years from what I would say the most experienced cyber representative at NATO to that of the deputy head of the cyber section, now the head of the cyber section. And the way I see, I think this should become what we call a directorate within NATO, a unit with highest responsibility. I'm going to start by asking him to address a bit the cyber threat landscape. And what are the most important trends that one can see in a run-up to the NATO summit from NATO's perspective. And with this, Christian, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Soren, and good afternoon to you all. It is indeed a pleasure to be back in DC, to be back in the United States. To me, this sort of represents almost like a homecoming, I tell you. I mean, having sort of with my one foot in Europe, but another one firmly fixed here in the United States with my background in West Point and in the School of Foreign Service. And it's good to be here in Hudson, good to be with you, Soren. Now, when it comes to NATO's story and cyber, I think we have to recognize that quite often, I mean, we tend to forget that NATO has been in this business of cyber for quite a long time. We just didn't call it cyber a very long time ago. It used to be information assurance, or it used to be the CIS security, etc. So the word cyber really sort of starts to emerge primarily after the 2007 cyber attacks against Estonia. And really the focus, you see that sort of change in our focus when it comes to sort of looking at this issue that I think used to be largely something that was very much a technical phenomenon, and nowadays we indeed, as you pointed out, we very much sort of look at it as part and parcel of everything that we do, and as something that has a sort of a strategic impact. And of course, you know, when you look at what is happening out there, the threat landscape, cyber quite often is not only an end to itself, but also a means to an end. In other words, when we look at what is happening, it's not only the attacks themselves, either against the sort of the NATO networks or against the allied networks, but it's also the range of different actors, the hacktivists, the criminals, but also I would put it to hostile state actors. And I would highlight indeed the attribution of NotPetya to the Russian Federation and WannaCry to the DPRK in this regard. That continued to challenge our sort of day-to-day activities. And what is also interesting in this regard is that quite often, and this was evidenced also in the DNC case, is that, as I mentioned, cyber being used as a sort of means to an end. In other words, you use cyber means in order to perhaps exfiltrate information, but then it is being used for other purposes in other means, by other means, which, according to my interpretation, sort of is connected but doesn't really fall within the understanding of what cyber defense is, at least from a NATO point of view. And quite often when you look at these attacks, well, I would also put it to you, NotPetya and WannaCry, they tend to fall into the gray area, not something that sort of is really below the threshold, that doesn't really sort of rise to the level of the armed attack, that I think continues to challenge us. and at least from the NATO's point of view, and actually sort of makes us think about also the different response options, with attribution, for example, being one of them, of how to handle that sort of a behavior in a below the threshold manner. I already mentioned the different range of actors. If I were to sum it up, or if I were to sort of characterize what is happening, I think what we see is really sort of the attacks becoming more common. Perhaps not necessarily more sophisticated. What I see is sort of not really sort of an exponential growth in zero-day vulnerabilities market, but really the sort of the use of the same old persistency, indeed, the same old sort of malware, but refurbished and used for other purposes. So more common, perhaps more sophisticated, but certainly more damaging. And I think part of it is also having to do with just the fact that the surface area, if I may call it that way, is getting bigger. We have the Internet of Things and the rest of it, whereby I think ourselves are also introducing new vulnerabilities to the system, which of course is also putting pressure on, at the end of the day, on how do we react to these events, not only at the technical level, but also at the political level.
Let me ask, is there any proportion, even if it's more qualitative, between being subject, NATO being subject to targeted attacks or just collateral damage from, those who are spreading their attacks like tut azimut in all directions? How do you see it from NATO's point of view?
We're very much connected to that ecosphere, so which means that, perhaps not surprisingly, I think the sort of the vast amount of stuff that is happening in our networks is pretty much the same, I think, that you would find also in other civilian networks. For example, ransomware. Well, NATO is not going to pay ransom, but it doesn't mean that we don't get hit with it. And indeed, you have what I would characterize a sort of a relatively small amount of advanced and persistent type of activities. But
and those are targeted for NATO.
Indeed, but quite often all it takes is one breach in order to take the system down. Well, fortunately, we haven't had any operational impact to NATO networks or NATO activities. But quite often when you look at the pace of change and really sort of where technology is moving and how fast technology is moving, what it tells you really that there isn't an endpoint. So you really have to sort of upgrade your defenses almost all of the time, build the airplane while you're flying it. And another interesting thing is that I think that the defense doesn't stop at the firewall. It's not only about the perimeter defense. Indeed, it's also about the people, it's about the processes, it's also about how you organize yourself in order to deal with that threat.
Speaking about public attribution, we both refer to the high-profile public attribution by especially US and UK, not PETIA, but there were other countries that associated themselves to this. And there were also some other countries like Germany, I think Denmark, Norway last year that went public with attributing some attacks against their government systems. My first question is, why did this happen more recently? I mean, last year, this year, not so much before. And how important do you think is to speak out when you have the relevant information, data analysis about this?
Well, first and foremost, I think the attribution remains the national prerogative. So right. It is indeed for the nations to make up their mind, and I think a fair amount of political judgment goes into that decision. Because even, when it comes to the attribution at the political level, I believe it's not really the same as something that you would do in a court of law. I mean, at least when it comes to the sort of the evidence that needs to be presented. Because it is a process, and then you're trying to influence the behavior of another state that is actually conducting the attacks. So it is a judgment call. It is a sort of a political decision in this regard, whether to go public or not, because there are other means of actually affecting the behavior.
Covered messages or...
Indeed, the private attribution.
Private attribution.
You can also just upgrade your defenses without attributing without actually telling anybody about what is happening. So really, to me, it is about a process. It is about the behavior that they are trying to influence. And I think in many ways, when we look at the attribution, perhaps really not from NATO's point of view, but trying to understand the context of what is happening, it is very much also, I think, connected to the norms of behavior and the norms that should apply in that global cyberspace.
So do you think it's breaking this culture of impunity that some of the threat actors, especially state threat actors, have developed over the years?
I believe so. I believe so. I mean, when you look at the sort of past examples, such as the sort of the indictment of PLA by the United States government, and really sort of the steps that followed, it seemed to have worked. So here too, I think what we're seeing is the sort of emerging behavior to really sort of signal back in regards to sort of what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior. And I believe this is what we are seeing happening out there in the market.
Now, going a bit deeper into the situational awareness, cyber situational awareness aspect at NATO, I know there are different levels from having a malware information sharing platform up to the cyber threat assessment cell work and the intelligence sharing. One of my points, and I use this opportunity also to advertise Hudson Institute paper, Strengthening NATO Cyber Defenses on the US leadership. One of the points was to create a joint comprehensive situational awareness and attribution platform at the NATO. Do you think this is too far stretched? Is this something that could be pursued in the, let's say, near or medium-term future?
If you recall your time in the office, indeed, I mean, what we tried to do was to really sort of, perhaps the sort of the Kevin Costner movie, The Field of Dreams, build it and they will come, indeed. So what we tried to do was to establish these platforms and to establish this sort of, a means to exchange information, to share information, malware information sharing platform, also having the RFI process with the allies, but also bringing in industry. And that is important to us because quite a lot of information actually, especially when you're dealing with indicators of compromise, does not have to be at the classified level. I mean, in fact, quite often what tends to happen is this over-sanitization or over-classification of events that are happening. So that's why, in order to have that good situational awareness, having multiple fleets, having multiple sort of contributors to that situational awareness, I think is important. And this is what we have tried to do, knowing fully well that at the end of the day, especially when it comes to the classified information sharing, there's a role for allies in this regard to play, because NATO is not an intelligence generating enterprise. We rely on allied input in this regard. Always more can be done, I believe so. For example, I think NATO's greatest strength, when you look at what we have done in the past, has been to sort of serve as a platform to either create standards or really improve interoperability, for example. I believe the same can be done when it actually comes to increasing trust in information sharing, in creating these sort of, well, for the lack of a better word, standards or sort of approaches whereby a greater trust would result and a greater sort of information sharing could result between allies.
In a way, you hinted to the concept that I would call information sharing interoperability, or information interoperability, to have information kind of standardized so that I don't know if maybe the battery just died out. So now it's working. Yeah. So do you think that benchmarks from this point of view need to be set as well, like the standardization of information exchange that is necessary for cyber?
I think it would certainly help, especially, and coming back to your previous question about the attribution, for example. I think the better we collectively also understand what goes into and what do we mean when we see something and when we assess something, the more robust mechanism there is. I think that doesn't sort of really take away from the sovereignty, from the sort of the national and political decisions that need to be made by allies. The more trust there would be in a system.
Thank you. Moving towards capabilities and cyber defense capabilities and then skills. NATO is having a double function, first to strengthen and develop its own cyber defense capabilities, and then also to create a standardized process of enhancing capabilities of allies. I want to ask you to focus on two things. When it comes to NATO, how strongly you feel that the procurement process in NATO limits the capacity to bring the most updated capabilities to the benefit of NATO cyber defense? And then when it comes to allied capabilities, cyber capability targets are now part of the defense planning process. And I know there's a new cycle of capability targets that has been approved. If you could highlight what are the key elements of this new targets for allies.
Well, starting with the sort of the second one, the NDPP, Next Generation Capability Targets. Perhaps for those that are not familiar with the NATO process, I mean, a lot of acronyms and a lot of abbreviations, but basically, it is a mechanism that we use in order to generate forces. So it is driven heavily by the sort of the operational requirements. It is the things that, well, the ships, the planes, the tanks, that we need in order to really be able to conduct allied operations and missions. And cyber is part of it. What we have tried to do over the years is really to also help allies generate their own national cyber capabilities. But really, I think an interesting shift has occurred with us having recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations. And I allude to my previous point in this regard. So instead of really trying to look at the network defense as a phenomenon in itself, what we are now trying to do is really to empower the operational commanders, so that the operational commanders would also be able to operate in that domain. That means, for those of you that have a military background, really taking something that traditionally has belonged to the J6 shop and really trying to sort of shift it more to the J3, the operations side, so that like I said, the operational commander would have all of the necessary capabilities. And as part of that mechanism, we're also sort of, trying to make that shift at the national level, so that the necessary capabilities would support the J3 shop to conduct the operations. Now, when it comes to the procurement and acquisitions, I would be intellectually dishonest if I didn't sort of comment on that. Indeed, in a situation where really sort of technology is moving very, very fast, this is one of the, what I would characterize in areas that we're having challenges with. Really, it is difficult to be honest to ourselves if you're moving into new platforms with the Windows XP and all of the old stuff still being in use. So without actually, I think, focusing on this part and trying to speed it up, I think it will be very difficult to turn the corner. Now, we have had some success in the past. In Afghanistan, in particular, we had operational requirements whereby we were able to sort of separate certain areas whereby an accelerated acquisition was possible. Looking at it from a cyber defense point of view, if we're not able to do the same on the cyber field, I think we will be constantly lagging behind.
Thank you for the sincerity and honesty, and I know that all those who are working on, let's say, IT-related subjects in NATO feel this pain. I, for one, was a strong proponent of having a really completely different and parallel process for IT procurement in NATO. You have this 5-year cycle for the normal physical platform, which is logical. They don't change as fast. But if you have a 5-year cycle for IT, for software, you always have yesterday's technology. So you need to maybe have a 5 months or 6 months or, at most a 12 months cycle. So I hope decision makers would take this into consideration and actually create a separate strand of work. And I think this should be supported by legislators as well.
It's also, I think, well, I'm not an acquisition kind of a person, but I think much also goes into how acquisition processes themselves work. So instead of going for this big decades-long platforms, I think just breaking them apart, being more modular and more agile, and actually sort of delivering things in chunks would help us as well. Delivering capabilities as part of bigger platforms, a decade is just, no, it's not going to work for us. But that is an area of challenge, I would admit, for the enterprise, for the NATO enterprise.
You touched upon aspects that have to do with the defense planning and the military planning within the alliance. And I think NATO has become a defense planning domain already for a number of years, and now with the recognition of operational domain, there's extra focus given to this. But let me ask you an aspect that has to do with the general culture in NATO. How much or how fast do you think we're moving from this traditional approach where defense planning is linked to the physical domains, to the classical domains, while we see that in the real world, the battlefield is increasingly digital? So is the kind of organization, the planning process, the resources involved catching up with the real world, or do we need to, push further and faster? So how do you see this?
Well, I would always like us to be more quicker. Let me put it this way. I believe more can be done, and especially when I look at and going back to where we started with the threat landscape, I think we need to run faster. That would be my sort of first sort of initial cut on this question. Well, at the same time, I have to recognize the fact that during the last 4 years, and you recall it as well, that's the journey that we took together. We were pushing the enterprise, and indeed quite a lot has been done in this regard. I mean, the recognition of cyberspace as a domain, the sort of the delivery of the pledge, etc. Quite a lot of sort of the initiatives have been put in place. To the extent that I would sort of say that NATO as an alliance, NATO as an organization, really, I think, stands at the cutting edge if I were to compare us to our sort of peers out there. But more can be done, indeed. I think the challenge with cyber quite often tends to be that it's abstract. It is not that something that is tangible. Sometimes it is difficult to explain, it is difficult to measure, it's difficult to quantify. I mean, let me take the cyber defense pledge that we're working on. Quite often, as we do our bilateral meetings with allies, the question comes up, I mean, what does good look like? How much should I spend on cyber? Is there a specific figure? Just like you have 2% for the defense spending, etc. So I think quite often we're also trying to come to grips with what this sort of new field, what does good look like in this new field? And consequently, it is sometimes difficult to make the case. But personally speaking, I think much more could be done. And of course, I'm tooting my own horn here.
Yeah, I was hesitating to ask you to respond to a question that I was being asked in the past, like what are the cyber equivalents of the tanks, the missiles, the fighter planes in the cyber domain, and how do you do the force planning in this domain? So use your imagination to...
You don't, is the right answer. I think when we're looking at this issue, we would rather sort of concentrate on the effects as such, rather than a classical force generation model. So really, because at the end of the day, what matters, and coming back to the sort of, once again, to the operational commander that needs to deliver effects on the battlefield, these will have to come from the national capabilities, from the NATO force structure, not from the NATO command structure. And we will rely, as we move into the future, to the national capabilities, voluntary effects provided to NATO on a voluntary basis by nations themselves. So really, it's the effects part that I think matters, and not really the sort of the force generation as such. I don't really see us sitting around the table and counting the tanks and the planes and what have you, but allies really sort of making up their decisions nationally. What kind of an effect will be provided as part of the NATO AOM.
So it's more like the special forces model and so on. You already mentioned a very important development that came with the recognition of cyber as an operational domain. And this is the work on the integration of potential voluntary sovereign contribution of national cyber assets for the purpose of NATO's missions and operations. And this should not be seen as something so different than in the other domains, because neither in air, land, or sea, NATO as an organization really has its own forces. It has a command structure. It's a platform, but actually it's the NATO the allied capabilities that are harnessed, and so this should be pretty much the same in the cyber domain. What I wanted to ask you was to dwell a bit deeper in two important announcements that were made public. One was at the Defense Ministry in November, where the Secretary General announced that a framework of political legal principles to integrate such national cyber contributions within NATO has been developed. So just describe the framework. And then in the February ministerial, he announced the setup of a cyber operations center at the level of the command structure. And this is the first time NATO has a cyber dedicated entity within the command structure. So what's the catch? What's the news with these two announcements, and how much do you think they will be like part of the deliverables package for the upcoming summit?
Let me put that into a context. In many ways, it is really a logical conclusion, a logical next step of us having recognized cyberspace as a domain. Because to us, it is part of a bigger effort. And really, I mean, once again, for those that have served in the military, I mean, we're looking at really all of the aspects of .MLPFI. I mean, what sort of a doctrine should we have? What sort of an organizational construct? How should we organize ourselves? What sort of training, education, how to finance that field, etc. And there are some changes indeed that have already occurred and that will occur over time. Indeed, one of them was the decision to create the Cyber Operations Center. So this is not a NATO Cyber Command. This is not the road or the path that we're taking, but really an entity in the Allied Command Operations that is meant to enable NATO Operational Commander to really execute missions in that domain. And as part of that mandate, indeed, and as discussed by the NATO Secretary General, we have developed a set of principles that are meant to assist us in actually sort of implementing that decision. So consequently, NATO will not have its own sort of offensive capabilities, but will have to rely on nations, on allies, providing these capabilities on a voluntary basis to NATO. Work is ongoing in this regard, and you alluded to the summit, and indeed we're looking at how to put all of the sort of other relevant pieces so that the puzzle is complete, so to speak, and that we can actually sort of have that operational commander be empowered, but also have all of the sort of the mechanisms, the necessary principles and organizational structure in place for these missions to take place. So this really, in the context of a broader transformation that is ongoing, is the sort of the step that I think we are ready to take in the next sort of foreseeable future.
So the cyber part will be an important item as part of NATO's defense deterrence posture.
Absolutely.
That will be updated at this upcoming summit.
Indeed, absolutely so. But let me also reiterate that this does not change the defensive mandate of NATO, and this doesn't really change, I think, the focus that we will continue to pay, not only internally inside the organizations, but also with allies on resilience. At the end of the day, first and foremost, this really sort of, you need to make sure that you're able to sort of make yourself less attractive target, if I may say so. You have to sort of upgrade your defenses, and because quite often I think what tends to be forgotten is that, especially in this domain, we are no longer sort of operating with an assumption that you have your castle with a moat around it. I would put it to you that detection has replaced the defense as a strategy. So you should actually sort of think that somebody is operating in your networks, and then the question is how quickly are you able to catch that malicious behavior, and how robust are your networks? How quickly are you able to sort of recover in this regard? So resilience will continue to be the central piece for us as we move ahead and also sort of implement our decision to recognize cyberspace as a domain. But there will be pieces that we will also sort of add to that existing basket, that existing toolbox that we have.
I do not want to end, and I will have just a couple of minutes, and then I will open it up for questions from the floor. I don't want to lose the importance, the idea of developing skills, the training, education, and the exercise part in this field. And also another aspect is the development of partnerships, knowing that cyber defense is a team sport by definition. So what's the news in terms of training and exercising, and in terms of deepening and expanding the partnerships of NATO?
I would put it to you that one of the main challenges that we have is not really technology. It's actually people. As part of the pledge discussions, I mean, what the picture that we see emerging, and I suspect that many in this room also agree to it, is that we haven't really reached the equilibrium point whereby we have this sort of nice balance between the supply and demand. No, this is not the case. I think demand, is far greater than the supply. Everybody's after the same sort of people, same skill set, same talent, and that is a challenge. So we have different sort of programs in place in order to really sort of help with the supply side. And when we look at it at the national level, it is also interesting that, well, it is contextual. Much depends on what kind of a skill set are you after and what do you want to use it for. So we have been able to identify some interesting national best practice when it comes to how to recruit talent and how to retain talent, because quite often this is not about actually money, this is about the mission. This is also about certification and training and education and the rest of it. So this is the sort of the part that we try to play in identifying that best practice, and sort of with the hope that it will help allies at the national level. In terms of exercises, here too we're trying to turn a corner, and instead of sort of treating cyber as something separate or unique, we want cyber, for example, to be integrated into all of the NATO exercises that we are conducting, all the way from the strategic level, the crisis management exercise that the Council sort of does on an annual basis, but also down to the sort of the operational and the tactical level. And partnerships are critical. So industry involvement, for example, in creating realistic exercise, but also EU. And here EU is an important partner in this regard. We have the technical agreement in place to exchange technical information with them. But EU quite often also brings an important regulatory aspect to the game that NATO doesn't. So whether it's, for example, increasing national cyber resilience through initiatives such as the Network Information Security Directive from this directive and the EU and what have you, we see it very much as a sort of a complementary track that this one particular partner to us employs.
And what about raising what I would call the cyber IQ at the policy level, those who are involved in the policy in legal matters? Does NATO do enough to, elevate this understanding and, again, cyber IQ?
Once again, I'm a very ambitious person, so I would have to say that more can be done. Now, being fully aware that over the last 2 or 3 years, the amount of time that the Council has dedicated at NATO to the cyber issue has more than tripled. I think the discussion is ongoing, so that's a good thing. But once again, the technology keeps moving ahead, and quite often I think more can be done also to really bring in the strategic level sort of decision makers. EU, for example, had this wonderful cyber exercise under the Estonian EU presidency. So these sorts of initiatives, I think, go a long way in order to sort of raise the what I have said, something that tends to be very abstract, that is intangible, to the senior decision level, senior sort of policymakers. That I think is one needs to be clever in regards to how and when to bring in the sort of the senior policymakers into this.
So you're confident that cyber is actually moving to reaching the level where it's get the key strategic role that it deserves on the NATO agenda?
Yes and no. More can be done, but I think we have made good progress, especially under your leadership.
So, okay. So on this both optimistic and realistic note, let me stop with my own set of questions. I would have more, but I would like to open the floor, and let's start with lady in front row, and I would kindly ask you to introduce yourselves and, of course, put forward some quick articulate questions.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School and was fortunate enough to be in defense when all of this was getting started. Nobody had any idea it would blossom into what it is. The question I have is about compatibility. I remember when the Navy and the Air Force were in a joint game and they realized they couldn't talk to one another because our buying process wasn't allowed. We were not allowed to create a winner. So we had to get all these others. So how do you deal with that when we're now dealing with this on a global basis?
Please, Christian.
Well, NATO doesn't really address the sort of the acquisition and procurement issues at the national level. Indeed, what we try to do is to make sure that systems are interoperable at the NATO level. So when we build, for example, the current initiative underway is the FMN, the Future Missions Network. What we want to make sure is that allies can actually sort of plug into that network and plug into that system, and that they can talk to each other. So rather than sort of trying to deal with issues at the national level, we leave it to allies themselves and look at the broad sort of enterprise level. What sort of interface is needed in order, if you will, a plug and play environment in order for us to be able to execute our missions. The same happened, for example, in Afghanistan during the ISAF mission with the AMN, Afghanistan Mission Network, that was run by NATO that we were responsible for, but basically that allowed for allies to plug into that environment. I guess, once again, if I were to be intellectually honest with you, we're circumventing the question a little bit and looking at it at the sort of at the very broad NATO enterprise level.
Thank you, John Heffern. John used to be on the North Atlantic Council every now and then. So,
thank you, Ambassador Carl. Welcome back to Washington. Thanks to Hudson Institute to bring you back to us on a regular basis. Look forward to working with you here. Foreign Service Officer. I'm now at Georgetown, and I was deputy at NATO and had the honor to sit on the council occasionally when my boss was out of town. Christian, good to see you again. Question is, I was struck by a couple of comments you made referring to cyber as largely a below the threshold threat, and that attribution is largely a national prerogative, which suggests that Article 5 elements of this are not in the forefront of our thinking on it now. I mean, this is not a hypothetical problem. I mean, we had what is clearly, I think, a hostile state attack on an ally in 2007. What is sort of the Article 5 thinking here?
A good question. Thank you, John. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, when we look at the applicability of Article 5, I think we want to maintain constructive ambiguity. I mean, there's no automaticity to it. There are no thresholds. I mean, it is basically a sort of a judgment call at the NAC level that needs to be sort of made. I would put it to you largely depending on the consequences. How severe the consequences are, and then basically it's just applying that political judgment into that situation. So in this regard, it's constructive ambiguity. What of course quite often poses the challenge is the sort of is that challenge that I mentioned, that quite often the events that we see happening actually sort of take place below the threshold, whereby it is, I mean, you do not necessarily want to bring a gun to a knife fight, if I may say so. But there are other tools that can be used. These can be diplomatic, these can be informational, etc. So I mean, NATO has been doing peacekeeping operations without there, necessarily having been a global war taking place, if I may use that analogy. So I think there are tools available, also linked to other sort of activities pursued, for example, by the European Union or by allies themselves. Quite often have to be taken into account when we're trying to de-escalate the situation. But Article 5 by no means is off the table. In fact, what we have recognized is that collective defense applies in cyberspace, and we are ready to, I mean, really to go full throttle, if I may use that analogy. But for the time being, and largely also because it is a sort of a fast evolving landscape, it remains sort of constructively ambiguous as to sort of when that declaration would have to then take place. And this is the question that I quite often get, and people quite often also wonder that, do you have to sort of respond to a cyber with cyber means, or what that response look like, and what does this mean, for Article 5, etc. I think here it's quite instrumental to sort of look back at what happened post 9/11, and our response actually sort of it wasn't. I mean, when you look at the time aspect of it, it took a couple of weeks for us to reach that conclusion. It wasn't symmetric. I mean, it was the deployment of AWACS in order to assist with the patrolling of the skies here in North America. So really, even when it comes to the sort of the potential invocation of Article 5, I think different and almost all of the tools in the toolbox are available if and when we try to sort of de-escalate the situation or to respond to what has taken place. But I suspect that as we go into the sort of into the summit and also the next summit, there will continue to be events that I think will continue to sort of challenge us in terms of below threshold, above the threshold. What does it mean, and what is the best way, politically speaking, to manage the sort of the response and the malicious sort of actor on the other side.
There was a question in the front row, and then I will turn to the other side, please.
Adam Powell from the University of Southern California. In this gray area, as you termed it at the beginning, the cyber attacks are, military cyber attacks are only part of what's happening. And we have infrastructure here in the United States. For example, electric power generation is a state function, not a national function. We have elections very much in the news on both sides of the Atlantic, where they are often local, state, or regional issues. To what extent is NATO cyber defense either coordinating with or communicating with these other civilian areas that are at risk?
That's an easy one. I could actually respond to you by saying very simply that NATO's primary task is the defense of its own networks, and when it comes to the protection of national networks, it's the responsibility of the allies. But I want to give you a sort of, I think, a longer explanation than that. I think, as you know, quite often it takes two to tango. It takes the attacker to attack and the defender to defend. But what I found a bit concerning is, for example, the events that happened in Georgia, for example, in Atlanta. I mean, really, sort of the ransomware having a really widespread impact in this regard. So on one hand, yes, indeed, I understand that sometimes when it comes to, you mentioned elections, but also critical infrastructure, not necessarily sort of a federal level issue, but the impact can actually be a strategic one. Our response to it has been to create, as I alluded to earlier, a cyber defense pledge, whereby we really try to sort of focus on and helping allies to increase their national cyber resiliency. And our sort of main aim here is to sort of trying to see what is the best practice in different places, in different countries, when it comes to the sort of protection of critical infrastructure, or when it comes to, for example, education, training, recruitment of skill, etc. Knowing fully well that it is contextual, and it is then up to allies themselves to sort of put in place the kind of a sort of mechanism that is fit for purpose at the national level, not really for NATO to grade somebody or to develop a standard in this regard. Personally speaking, when I look into what is happening, I quite often feel that not all market players are sort of, making progress as fast as they should. I'm a bit concerned about small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, because quite often cyber tends to require, well, money. And so quite often the MNCs, the multinational companies, tend to do better than some of the small and medium-sized enterprises, mom and pop store out there in the sort of, street corner. So, but fortunately, and once again, trying to be intellectually honest, this is not something that we have to worry about. This belongs to the allies at the national level. What we try to do, of course, is to, like I said, identify, these things, the mechanisms that work, that then hopefully can be made use of by allies at the national level.
Just to have a quick follow-up, since it was also part of this development of the Cyber Defense Pledge. Cyber Defense Pledge was a political instrument actually to help widen a bit the mandate of NATO. The mandate of NATO was focusing on its own networks and mainly creating standards for the, let's say, military and government networks of its members, not towards critical infrastructure. But with the pledge and assuming this by heads of state and government, it was like pushing the mandate forward towards setting some best practices, standards, and raising the strategic attention for this critical infrastructure, upon which each country's defense and NATO actually defense ultimately depends. So it was, as I said, political instrument to go beyond this dilemma, how you focus on your main mandate, which is military defense, but knowing that you rely on some civilian assets and so on. There was a question in the back, and then I'll come also to Peter, please.
My name is Roger Cochetti, and I work with private equity in the technology sector. And I wanted to come back to a subject that you did your best to deal with several times in the earlier conversation, and that is resource allocation, funding, quantification, that sort of stuff. And I don't think we can really abandon the topic for two reasons. First, NATO has explained its mission and its resource requirements for 50 years based on quantification. We endless little tanks on one side and little tanks on the other side and little soldiers on one side and little soldiers on the other. That's how it explains to people who control funding what funding is needed. And secondly, it's obviously very gray, but every billion euros that NATO spends on cyber means at least there's €1 less that it has to spend on tanks. So there is some trade-off in resource. It's not one-to-one, but it's something. For those reasons, I'd want to return to the subject and maybe try it in three ways that might make it easier. First, if we pretended for a moment that cyber consisted of three categories: hardware, software, and talent, how would you compare NATO with Russia? Second, could you give any kind of estimate? And obviously, we all know that on the Russian side, there's non-state actors, there's state actors, there's everything. But on the NATO side, there's non-state actors and state actors and everything. So some comparison in budget between NATO and Russia in cyber military, cyber defense. And then thirdly, and maybe most easily, is there any area where you would trade NATO capabilities for Russian capabilities in this field? That's a very easy way to sort of get right. Is there anything where you'd say, hey, I'll take what they have as opposed to what I have, and then we know that that's a hot issue. So thank you.
So you have an opportunity to generate some real news now. Yeah, answer all these questions.
Not. When it comes to the resource allocation, indeed, I mean, the difficulty that we have had in my shop, and this part of the reason is why we're sort of, shying away from the quantitative stuff, is that we ourselves quite often do not know what good looks like. We cannot give a figure, and if we did, that figure would be dishonest, because it's not only about the amount of money that you're spending, it's also how you're spending it. So that's why quite often when, for example, as part of the NDPP that I mentioned, but also as part of the pledge, we want to focus on qualitative aspects of it, and really sort of the effects part of it. So instead of telling an ally how many people should work in your national CERT, we focus, for example, quite often on the effects part of it. Your ability to monitor the network 24/7, to detect anomalous behavior, et cetera, just as an example. How you do it and how you figure it out at the national level is really the responsibility of allies themselves. So that's first. Really sort of the qualitative rather than quantitative angle to it. And if somebody comes up with a number, I would be very suspicious. Watch the space, because at least when it comes to resource allocation, what we see is also an upward trend. So the pledge is having an impact. We are currently planning an event on the 15th of May in Paris with a separate sort of speech by the Secretary General in this regard. So there seems to be an effect when it comes to the pledge, at least when it comes to resource allocation. So it seems that we are getting to the sort of the decision makers, and that more attention is being paid also when it comes to sort of actually allocating money in order to improve things. When it comes to comparison between NATO and Russia, it's a bit difficult because when it comes to the numbers, I mean, it's a bit opaque when it comes to, what is it that I'm comparing myself to. Quite often, I think it ends up being sort of apples and oranges. I mean, it's a difficult one to make. I do believe that if we were to, hypothetically speaking, compare ourselves, there is one great strength that we do, and that's innovation. It's the sort of really not only the innovative spirit, but really the human talent that I think provides that competitive advantage. And I'm not only talking about the number of Nobel Prize winners, but really sort of innovating and sort of, creating that new technology. I think that's perhaps the biggest competitive advantage that we have. So I'd rather like to sort of look at the positive side rather than the negative side. What is it that we don't that they do? I think that's the sort of real advantage that we have in this game.
Would you take anything Russian as opposed to what NATO has? Any category where you say, I'll take what they have?
Not really.
Not a troll factor in St. Petersburg. Please.
Thank you. Marisa Lino with Northrop Grumman. And I'm also happen to be the head of the U.S. delegation to the NATO Industrial Advisory Group, or the NIAG. Our friends in Turkey appear to be poised to complete the purchase of S-400 system from Russia. Does this pose, in your opinion, any particular cyber threats for NATO?
It's another one of those.
Yeah, but you can only focus on the cyber threat, so that's easy. That should be easier.
I'm not familiar with the S-400 as such, but I would imagine that it would be difficult, very difficult, to integrate that into the kind of the system that we have at NATO.
Oh, just the presence of it in conjunction with other systems is, I think, a concern, no?
Well, it is really the sort of the responsibility of that particular ally to make that decision and also sort of to live with the consequences. When it comes to sort of acquiring capabilities at the national level, it is a national prerogative. However, and sort of going back to my previous points, when it comes to actually making the system interoperable, we have to be aware that there are consequences. Some things are just impossible or difficult to integrate into that sort of common framework that we are developing.
Please, there was another question in the row.
Matthew Hawkins from Aiken Gump. Thank you, Christian, for being here today. I appreciate it. Want to go back to your human talent line. I really enjoyed your example about building the airplane while flying it. And you accurately stated that, you know, people are the biggest challenge for you guys. So how crucial is it, in your opinion, that NATO members train, upskill, certify their people so that we can keep that airplane airborne?
Very important, indeed. But I also have to sort of be honest. I mean, when I look at the different initiatives that have been put in place, they are very encouraging. I mean, everybody does it in their own way. So some run, you know, summer boot camps. Some run sort of open source sort of recruitment where everybody can apply, and then after you pass a series of tests, I mean, you could actually sort of become a hacker for hire, for example, working for your government, etc. So different initiatives have been put in place. I'm just wondering whether this will be enough given the really sort of the demand out there in the market. Because at the end of the day, I don't really think that the problem here is, like I said, technology. A problem is people and policy. How do we organize ourselves? How do we have the right policies in place? And how do we bring the right kind of people you know, to stay with us? So it's recruitment and retention. I mean, you can also outsource, I guess, chunks of it to private industry in order to fulfill that function. But you have to also figure out what that means to you and what functions do you then sort of outsource and then what do you keep it for yourself. Different national best practice in this regard. There's not sort of one size that fits all. But I mean, coming back to my previous point about the innovation, I think it's the sort of the human angle, the talent that really provides us with that competitive advantage. Quite often what you see is that once we're able to sort of roll out the product or a technology, it is quickly copied and then implemented in some other place. But it's a difficult one to copy human beings. So it's what we bring to this game, I think, that provides us with that advantage.
Passing the floor to my good friend and colleague, Peter Flory, I can't help myself of thinking about this country song. I was country when country wasn't cool. So Peter was focusing or doing cyber when cyber wasn't as cool as today, because he at that time, the cyber policy was addressed in the Defense Investment Division. So Peter, with this setting, you have the floor for the question.
Thank you very much, Soren. You're the man who made it cool. Actually, when both of you opened the event, your discussion of the evolution of what NATO focused on in cyber was actually very telling. It reminded me of when I was there, which started just a few weeks before the attack on Estonia. This was one of a number of dossiers that I had that within a few weeks of my arriving suddenly, and I'm not going to pretend that I predicted this myself, quickly took off in importance and obviously quickly became a main topic. And in terms of the involvement of the Council, I don't know if I ever would have gotten to talk to the Council about cyber, but all of a sudden I was briefing the Council several times a year on it. But the other point in terms of the evolution is that we were focused, as you said, Christian, on primarily technology and technological approaches to the security and integrity of operational systems, the military in particular, but also the civilian. But I remember sitting around and talking about one of our nightmares, which was that, and this came after the Georgia events, what if during the Georgia events somebody had gotten into the NATO website and planted a false story. You know, NATO invokes Article 5, planning to send troops to Georgia. Well, you know, things would have hit the fan in a big way then. And I confess we were imagining, but we really weren't thinking in terms of the weaponization of information and false information the way we've seen it recently. In terms of your acquisition challenges, this was one of the many things I tried and failed to fix when I was at NATO headquarters. Basically, there were a lot of reform agendas, and this one didn't quite make it. I hope that somebody will come back to it. You know, I think the challenge in this area, and we really beat our heads against the wall. I remember saying after Estonia, okay, we've got to accelerate NSERC, which is the NATO cyber defense system, and being told, sir, we'll be lucky if we're only X years late. And I said, okay, that is not going to work. I'm not going to go to the NAC and tell them that. So we were able to catch it up somewhat, but it was, what was striking was the inability of the system to adjust to what was clearly a new reality. And there are a couple of reasons. One is the process, which is very diffuse, and where authority and responsibility are often not in the same place. Another part is simply the role of nations. I mean, this is not something, when NATO money is spent, the nations, they like to keep a close eye on that, and that's perfectly legitimate. But at the end of the day, particularly with fast-breaking technology, there is a tendency sometimes, you know, for perfectly good reasons of sort of quality control and oversight, and sometimes for more invidious industrial competition or other reasons where the nations interfere. And there actually is a question in this. The question I would have is, given how much time has elapsed, given the seriousness of the threat, is there any progress? Possible in either a solution like Ambassador Dukaru suggests, of having sort of a separate track, or some variation on that would basically say to the nations, look, there's some things that have to happen quicker than you're letting them happen. And, you know, we promise to, you know, to do our homework, and you obviously aren't going to have it happen without national oversight. But at the end of the day, we need to take this out of, there's a couple of particular technical groups where things would often go to die. And I'm just curious to see if there's been any progress made or envisioned in that regard. And the second question is more political. In response to the previous question, there's nothing that Russia has that I particularly envy from the perspective of NATO, except for maybe one thing, which is agility in decision making. And basically, there's a big difference between the NAC and the space between Mr. Putin's left ear and his right ear, which is where a lot of Russian decisions get made. One of the things that we tried to emphasize when I was there was the importance of exercises. I know you have taken that much further than we ever got it. And particularly the importance of exercises that actually stress decision-making with difficult and ambiguous situations, which is kind of the essence of what we're talking about here. And to the extent you can talk about it, I'd be curious to see how much progress has been made in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Christian, and I think this would probably be the last question.
On acquisitions, as you know, and indeed, I was glad to host you back in Tallinn when you came over with the DPPC. I remember it well. Well, what it is basically trying to get to a good balance between actually sort of looking at the operational requirements, things that we need and we need quickly, and balance this with the sort of nations and the sort of national oversight, political oversight, etc. So it's always a tricky issue. What I can say is that, I mean, question is asked, and then we're actively discussing this. Watch this space, I guess, is the sort of my response on this one. When it comes to the agility in decision making, indeed, this is a benefit, but it can also be a drawback, because I mean, it can also result in sort of quick miscalculation that will actually escalate sometimes to strategic blunders. So I see sort of benefits in both models, where, you know, you're able to perhaps make decisions quickly versus in a sort of system whereby you have to balance your interest against those of others. That slows it down, but actually sort of make sure that at the end of the day you get to where you want to be without actually making mistakes. So it is contextual, is what I'm trying to say. It really depends on the circumstances. And when it comes to allied decision-making, the agility of decision-making, I think the structures are there, going back to the sort of the field of dreams. I mean, that baseball sort of field, it's there. So quite often it depends on how allies want to play ball, and how quickly do you want to move things forward. It really sort of, to me, boils down to the political will, and really sort of negotiations in this regard of how that baseball field is being used. That to me sort of, I have seen things move fast. I have seen things move perhaps not as fast as they could be. So really, it's as good as allies make it, would be my response.
I think there was, okay, so then very quick ones. 1, 2, please.
Hi, I'm Nick Liserson. I work for Congressman Langevin. I have a quick question about one of the things that we've been focusing on the Hill is supply chain, cybersecurity, risk management, and I think it must be particularly difficult for NATO because part of your supply chain is all of these allies that are going to work in a joint environment that might not have a handle on their own supply chain risk, so they might be bringing vulnerabilities to the table that they don't even know about. So how do you manage that when you want to have a plug-and-play interoperable environment, but you don't necessarily know what vulnerabilities are coming to the table?
That's a tricky one. I think quite often it depends also on the kind of the system or the kind of a sort of device or what we're talking about. Quite often it is easiest just to rely on the sort of the national standard, on a national decision that has been made in this regard, instead of sort of trying to come up with a NATO standard or a NATO sort of requirement for the supply chain. But that is easier said than done, and I recognize that when you look at the global supply chain, also at the national level, it is difficult to identify what parts come from where and how do you certify something. We quite often do not have to answer that question at the NATO level. We rely on allies answering that question. So I keep my fingers crossed for you.
The truth is that the supply chain requirement in the NATO defense among the cyber defense capability targets is actually the most difficult to achieve according to the responses that we get from each and every nation. For the NATO systems, we have the NATO Office of Security who has very clear standards. So any system that comes under the, in the headquarters go through a kind of really tough screening process and so on. But to have this disseminated to all allies is a difficult task, especially since it's a moving target. There are new technologies. So this one, I think we had the first time this capability target established in 2013, and it's still the most difficult to achieve at the level in each and every nation. There was one quick one here, and then I'm trying to wrap it up. So it's a pity not to give the chance for such really very interesting question.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Svirin. I'm from the Russian Embassy here in Washington. So, first of all, thanks a lot for a very nice presentation. We heard a lot about attribution of the attacks today. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any proofs to that. But you described it quite well today, saying that it was a political decision of some countries. But my question is in regard to another thing. As you well aware, all the best and probably the most effective disarmament treaties were done, they were done during the Cold War, when Soviet Union, the United States and NATO, we were talking to each other. All these treaties made our world a more safe place. Right now we're talking about cyberspace. There are several initiatives from the Russian side, including the Code of Conduct, we can call it Code of Conduct of Responsible Behavior of the States in Cyberspace. There is also an initiative which is called the United Nations Convention on Cybercrimes. Unfortunately, we do not have a feedback from our colleagues. So, in this regard, there is just one question. Don't you think that probably we should start dialogue on cyberspace instead of making blaming each other for everything, but just to start dialogue, to discuss everything, just for the experts to sit down and work out rules of behavior, norms of behavior. Probably it will make world a more safe place than just.
Thank you so much for the question, because I think this is important, especially since, for example, NATO has been part of this dialogue, at least in the OEC framework, while not being a member of the OEC, but being invited to these discussions, and also in the UNGG process, where it has been both briefed and also invited to have comments and so on. So maybe you can refer to this, Christian, because this is also part of stability, as it was mentioned.
My short answer would be very simple, but you wouldn't like it. And the short answer is that NATO doesn't really create norms, and we do not have a role in norms creation as an organization. We have expressed support to the norms of responsible state behavior, as it indeed would contribute to a more stable, secure cyberspace. So initiatives that are in place in this regard, indeed the OSCE with the CBM, the confidence building mechanism development, as well as the UNGGE are important fora in this regard. Bearing in mind fully that NATO doesn't really, as an organization, doesn't have a role in this regard. So we were also a bit, I guess, disappointed that the last UNGGE last year did not deliver, because I think it would have been useful, also from the norms development point of view. Personally speaking, when I look at the developments that are to take place, you have, I think, United Nations Secretary General announcing that the debate would take place in United Nations. But I think it remains to be seen what form this dialogue will take. I mean, will there be the next UNGGE? How that debate will actually take place remains to be seen. I mentioned that it takes two to tango. I mean, in this case, it takes more than two to tango. It takes actually sort of all of the different players to really sort of agree to that way ahead in order to come to a sort of an understanding of what sort of norms should there be in international fora. I completely agree that the dialogue is needed, but I think also political will is needed in order to make progress in this regard. So really, I mean, once again, from NATO point of view, as an organization, we do not have a role. It is sort of, it's nations that are subjects to sort of international relations, nations that create the norm, nations that create the international law. So also, Russian Federation has a role to play in this regard.
And by the way, while not being a norm-setting organization, I should emphasize that at the Warsaw Summit, when NATO linked cyber defense with collective defense, at the same time, it recognized politically the applicability of international law in cyberspace, which was in itself a political statement of prevention, preferring to have a governed state and governed cyberspace, and actually avoid confrontation rather than being, let's say, pushed into defending allies in such a confrontation. And also, as I mentioned, NATO was always open in this dialogue, and one of the interesting dialogue between organizations was between NATO and OEC, both OEC coming to brief NATO on the confidence building measures that have been developed, and the other around NATO briefing. I've been twice in Vienna on what its policy is like and how it fits with the applicability of international law. And last but not least, the fact that the Center of Excellence in Tallinn, which is not NATO's own center, it's accredited by NATO, it's owned by the member states, but it has developed this resource, which is the Tallinn Manual. It's not a treaty, it's not something recognized, not even by NATO members, but it's actually expertise, a kind of compendium of international expertise in this field. Well, since I don't see any other questions, and before thanking Christian, since we are in Washington, in the US, let me just end on one question. Is US doing enough in the NATO framework to, project its leadership, bring its contribution, both in the political debate, but also in the kind of more, let's say, action plan implementation phase on cyber defense. And by the way, I'm doing this also to advertise, as I said, a study published by the Hudson Institute on strengthening NATO cyber defense under US leadership. And of course, this was also consulted and also provided to NATO as a resource for the upcoming summit.
The United States remains a critical ally in all of the sort of consultations and discussions that we have in this regard. Allow me to also take this opportunity to really recognize the US sort of service members and women and their families for all of the sacrifices that they have made to sort of alliance operations and missions. I mean, United States is a critical ally in this regard. What can I say? I mean, quite often when recently when I flew over and I watched The Darkest Hour, the recent movie, it sort of reminded me of Winston Churchill's quote that, the only thing that is worse than fighting with allies is to fight without allies. So there is friction in the system. I mean, it takes time to come to an agreement, to come to a consensus. But at the end of the day, I mean, when I look at this really sort of grand alliance, and I would say that arguably the most successful military alliance in history, I think we have the elements that it takes to continue to sort of keep it in that way. And I really look forward also to the US role in this regard.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Christian. This was a delight. This reminded me of our brainstorming sessions some year ago, a couple of months ago. And I want to praise once more your leadership and your role as a key player in the management of both policy development and its implementation in NATO headquarters. It's good to have you back in Washington. I did not go through the whole CV Christian mentioned. He has studied both at West Point and at the School of Foreign Service, and he has also been a defense counselor at the Estonian embassy during the enlargement process. So it's always good to have you back. Godspeed with your work for the upcoming summit, and I'm sure it's not it is the first time but not the last time that you're coming to Hudson. Maybe you come to brief us after the summit towards the end of the year. Let me give you and let me have a round of applause. Thank you.